Our next speaker, who is from Canada, has been acknowledged as one of the world's leading keynote speakers on innovation. He has keynoted at events such as the World Conference on Quality USA, the India Innovation Summit, Oasis of Excellence Conference in France, and the Asia Pacific Conference in Shanghai. As chief executive of one of the leading design brands in Europe, he has been an innovator in one of the most demanding markets.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, here to talk about innovating for the future, let's give a warm welcome to the current chair of the Canadian Committee to ISO TC 279 Innovation Management, ASQ Canada, Mr. Peter Merrill.
Well, hello everybody, and a pleasure to be with you. On my next slide, I'm going to give you an outline of a report that came from the World Economic Forum, which is called The Future of Jobs. That analysis was first published in 2016 when the WEF met in Davos in Switzerland, and it projected what they saw as the critical skills that were going to be needed by the year 2020. And top of the list was complex problem solving. And they saw that a third of all jobs were going to require that skill across all industry. I'm going to explain not just that, but the primary competencies in the report and how they link together, and most importantly, how they enable innovation. So let me show you on the next slide what that report has detailed. You'll see back in 2015, it showed complex problem solving as the #1 skill, and again in 2020. But what I particularly want to draw your attention to is back in 2015, they showed a skill called quality control at #6 on the list. And when you look at 2020, it's not even on the list. That's a reflection of the advances that we've made in just 5 years. With the advances in big data leading to machine learning and artificial intelligence, those jobs that used to require data analysis are being done automatically for us. But also, if you look at 2015, you'll see creativity just crept onto the list at #10. But when you look at 2020, there it is at #3. A significant jump. And that is a jump that had been predicted by many other analyses. The IBM CEO survey, the PricewaterhouseCoopers CEO survey, all of them showed creativity as becoming an increasingly important skill set. But I want to draw your attention to one other skill in 2020 that was being projected, that was not even on the list in 2015, emotional intelligence. But the WEF has just, only last week, published its projections for the year 2025. And I'm going to show you those on the slide. You'll see on the left the 2020 skills, and on the right you'll see the projections for 2025. And in fact, right at the top of the list is innovation in 2025. It was not specifically listed as a skill. It was implied back in 2015 and in 2020, but now it's spelled out. And in fact, complex problem solving is how we innovate. There are a couple of other things, though, that I want to point you to in 2025. In red, I've shown active learning. We're in a world now of continuous learning. And also, we're in a world where we're going to have a learning strategy. We're going to have to learn continuously and learn remotely. If you look at the right-hand side of this slide, from skills 1 to 6, those in fact are the core skills that we're going to need in the next 5 years. And on the next slide, I will explain to you how those link together. It's very interesting when you look at these skills more closely, that in fact, complex problem solving, which is synonymous with innovation, starts with understanding complexity. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But then, even though we understand complexity, we recognize that within that, we have to be able to solve complex problems, and we can't do that on our own. So we need a collaborative environment. And the next thing we've learned is that in that collaborative environment, we need diversity. We need a group of people with diverse backgrounds. But there is a challenge there, because diversity brings stress, it brings tension. And so for people who are of diverse backgrounds, they need to have emotional intelligence to work together. You start to see how all these skills that I've mentioned previously, they all link. And then we come to numbers 5 and 6, which are the core skills of creativity and critical thinking. And you will have heard these terms divergence and convergence for many, many years, but not everybody fully realizes what they mean. We diverge through creativity to find many alternative solutions, and then we converge through critical thinking to select what is the best path forward. But you can't just suddenly do that. You need that platform of collaboration, diversity, and emotional intelligence to enable the divergence and convergence. And you notice the last item I pointed you to on this slide is that all of this needs leadership. Leadership to hold it together and leadership to deliver. So on the next slide, let me take you into this whole business of complexity. Innovators solve complex problems. We innovate in a complex environment. We're in a world of incredible change, a perfect storm of change. So we need to understand complexity. You'll smile when I tell you that one of the definitions of complexity that I've found is hard to understand. Well, I think we can do a bit better than that. When you look for the definition of complexity, actually you find that it has a very similar definition to a system. And we're getting used to the idea of systems and system thinking. So a system is a set of interrelated and interacting elements. That's the definition we use in ISO when we talk about management systems. But those elements are not just processes. They're processes, they're people, they're technology. And all of those elements in a complex system are linked together. So you start to get a feeling for what complexity is about. But let me take you a little deeper on the next slide. One of the first things you find about complex system is that cause and effect are often not adjacent. We experience what we call the butter effect. It was a term that was first coined by James Gleick in his book Chaos. And he said, a butterfly flaps its wings in Singapore and it leads to a hurricane in the Caribbean. But there's even more to deal with. When you're dealing with complexity and when you're dealing with systems, the changing context is also unpredictable. It's erratic. We don't know, for instance, what a customer is going to do next. We try to predict it, but we can't. So, given we're dealing with complexity internally and externally, there's overall an appearance of chaos. And so James Gleick's book was very aptly named. Put that in practical terms. Our salespeople talk to the customer. The customer says what they want. The salespeople go back to the design and engineering people, and they put together a specification. Meanwhile, the customer's thinking. Their mind is not static. And so now we put the idea into operations, and we made some assumptions, and there is chaos. So you start to see what we're dealing with in our world of chaos. There are many unknowns, and to use a popular term, we're going to find unknown unknowns. And so we innovate in this world of uncertainty. I can point you to a couple of good reads on this. The one I mentioned, which is James Gleick's book, Chaos. But there's also another very good read called Linked by Albert Laszlo Barabasi. Both are paperbacks. Both are easy reads. So let me take you on to the next level of thinking. Innovation is hand in hand with complexity. It is travel complexity. But traditionally, we tend to focus on process problems. And what innovators need is a system approach. And there are many layers in the system. So to innovate, we need to think system, we need to use collective knowledge, and then we need to balance critical thinking and complexity. So I'm going to have you look at some examples of complexity on the next slide. And this is an exercise we have in our workshop on future skills. We ask people to look at these different examples of complexity and pick one that they see is most attractive. As they say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Then, which is least attractive? Then, which is simplest? And then, which is most complex? They go through those 4 steps. And then I ask people to, okay, you've picked out, you prefer. And by the way, in the exercise, they're all numbered. Which do you prefer? But discuss them with a colleague or someone else in the group and see what they've picked. And we suddenly start to realize that everybody's picked something different. And I ask them, well, why did you pick them? And then we start to realize that everybody's perception of complexity is a little bit different. And start to realize also that we're going to have to work with people whose perceptions are different from our own. And so that takes us into the need for collaboration. So on the next slide, I'm going to start explaining collaboration. A collaborative environment is one in which people come together with different experiences. People often ask me, oh, I'd like to collaborate, Peter. And I say, sure. What do you think I can bring to the table? What do you think you can bring to the table? And that question often stumps them. And I say to them, look, unless we're bringing 2 very different experiences or sets of knowledge to the table, our collaboration is pointless. Collaboration is there to create collective knowledge. And it's through collective knowledge that we find radical solutions. But immediately, because we're all different, there's a certain tension. And so everybody's got to feel safe. They must feel they're not open to criticism. And we've got to recognize the other party brings an asset. Stephen Covey had a famous saying in his 7 Habits, seek to understand before you see understood. The other person may bring market knowledge we don't have. They may have, or particular tools and technology. Linus Pauling underlined the value of collaboration. He won his Nobel Prize. He won it in physics, I'm originally a chemical engineer, and I'd like to think that he won it for chemistry because he won it in chemical bonding, which is actually physical chemistry. And you know, Linus Pauling said after he'd won his prize that he'd won it for better collaboration, not from better intellect. In other words, he was able to share knowledge with a wide range of people. Not the smartest guy on the, but yes, perhaps he was, because he was willing to share. Next slide, please. And so let me give you some examples of great collaborators in history. Perhaps one of the most famous is Michelangelo. That magnificent work in the Sistine Chapel, he wasn't done by him alone, you know that. He had a silent collaborator called Sebastiano, but there was a dozen other people working with him as well. That was a team effort. Right up to the present day, Brin and Larry Page, a Russian and an American, they worked together to create Google. Two very different perspectives. And you know, the story is of J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Back in the 1930s, which were difficult days, they were both at Oxford University, and they used to meet in a pub in Oxford. Every Tuesday evening, they had a beer and they had a chat. Funnily enough, I used to have a group of friends that I used to meet every Tuesday evening. And you know, it's those informal, relaxed occurrences where you often have some of your best thoughts. Well, out of their meeting in the 1930s came The Lord of the Rings from Tolkien and The Chronicles of Narnia from C.S. Lewis. Different books. Lewis, an extremely religious man, Tolkien perhaps a little dark. Both writers, of course. And you know, one of the great examples of where the concept of collective knowledge comes together in practice is at the race course. I'm not a gambler. You know, I run a business of gambles in that. But anyway, for those people who go horse racing, they'll understand this. The bookmakers don't set the odds on the horses based on their own expertise. They go to the races every day. They know the horses, but they look at where the crowd places the bets. And this is often called, and you've probably read the book, The Wisdom of Crowds. So let me take you to the now. And to get this knowledge, we need to network. We use what's called open networking to share knowledge, and also to create new knowledge, that spark between different bodies of knowledge, which also releases our collective subconscious. We often call it the spark of ingenuity. You know, the great breakthroughs often come at the intersection of bodies of knowledge. It's not new that. The concept of the think tank goes back to World War II. What we've also learned is that it's not the people we know directly, it's the people they know as well. The second degree of separation, where we harvest some of the most important knowledge. And a bit of research that surprised me was that we're more likely to find a job through a friend of a friend than reading job advertisements. But there is a danger with open networks. There's a danger that they morph into closed networks, and we find that, unfortunately, in our organizations. We get this thing called stovepiping or siloing. And that's, I have to say, a lot of that is the result of the focus on teams. You know, companies set up teams and they become team only. And teams within the company fight with each other instead of collaborating with each other. We need teams to collaborate. And one more factor for successful collaboration is this thing you've heard of so much, diversity. And let me take you into some interesting research on that in the next slide. Professor Scott Page, the California Institute of Technology, was doing some research back in 2008, actually. He was looking at the effect of IQ on problem solving. And naturally, he had the, should we say, the opening premise that the higher the IQ, the easier you could solve problems. So he brought together a group of Mensa people, high IQ people. But he knew in a control group, as any good researcher would do, and he went into the cafeteria and he picked up a group of people randomly in the cafeteria. And you're probably wondering why I've got this picture here of a pair of socks, a mismatched pair of socks. He actually called his ordinary guys the brown socks group. The Mensa people all had identical knowledge. They were all from the same background. So the result was their knowledge was not additive. The ordinary people, they were very diverse, and they had what was called additive knowledge. The big shock to Scott Page was that the Mensa group was repeatedly beaten. And one of his primary conclusions was there's a low correlation between IQ and problem solving. So I bring you good news. There's hope for us all there. What's important for solving problems is that we need a diverse body of knowledge. So let me take you into the next step on diversity. On the next slide, there is a challenge here. It's a thing called the mirror trap, and that blocks diversity. We practice it in our recruitment without even thinking. We want people who are going to fit comfortably in our company, in our organization. And so we tend to attract people who are similar to ourselves. And that reinforces our existing beliefs. It makes us feel comfortable. But to solve problems, we need knowledge that we ourselves don't have. And this picture on the right of the screen here is a good illustration of this. It's a group that I worked in the past. I do a lot of work in ISO in different areas, and this was a group working on a new standard, a new guidance document on quality management in projects. And just going through the group, and they were all friends of mine. Top left is David from Kenya. I can't remember everybody's name, so I won't even try. The next guy is from Spain, then Colombia, then the UK, then down to the front row is China, then the USA, then Japan. There was me taking the photograph and a few other people as well. We were a diverse group, and we respected each other's knowledge and background. That's one of the great things about the work in ISO. You know, it sounds boring writing standards, but it's actually really exciting stuff as you share knowledge with other people. And, you know, we're very respectful in ISO, but diverse groups aren't always like that, because diversity creates attention. If we set up a diverse group, we're deliberately mixing with people who are not like us. And that takes us into the next skill set to enable collaboration, and that is emotional intelligence, which I'll explain on the next slide. Emotional intelligence is about, as it suggests, managing our emotions. And our emotions drive our behavior, our own behavior and the behavior of others. And particularly in diversity, we need to be able to manage our emotions to address those tensions, especially if we're under pressure. So more and more companies are investing in the development of EI, as it's called. And, you know, a lot of people, when they're looking to set up partnerships and collaborate, check out the EI of the other people. In the West, there's a tendency to look at the financials, you know, is this financially viable? I do a lot of work in the Middle East, and there, partnering is very much based on, can I work with this person? EI takes time, but there's a significant payback. And, you know, you look at this picture on the right and it's a couple playing chess. somebody won, but well, I love chess actually, but they're still good friends, and that's important. Let's have a look at the next slide. Here are the key attributes of emotional intelligence. One of the pioneers in the field was a guy called Daniel Goleman. He broke it down into 5 attributes. First of all, self-awareness, knowing what you feel and why you feel it. Now that might sound simple. You know when you're happy, you know when you're sad. But what about feelings? We know when we're mad. And, you know, the next point, self-management, means being able to control that. So you don't dump your emotion, particularly if it's bad emotion, you don't dump it on other people. And, you know, if you're happy, great, you know, share it around. But if you're not a good thing to share sadness around. Unless you've got a good friend and, you know, they may comfort you. But you see my point. We need to understand our feelings and we need to manage our feelings. And then the third attribute, motivation, is having the drive to do this actually. And the outcome then becomes one of empathy, being able to empathize with the other person. And all of this comes together to create social skills. So let me move you on to the next slide, and you can develop emotional intelligence yourself. I'm going to suggest you do a web search. Try and find 2 or 3 different tools. Find what areas you want to strengthen. And let me just point out to you, the research has shown that moving forward, emotional intelligence is going to have twice the importance of science, technology, engineering, mathematics. All of that stuff is going to be taken care of by a very small body of people. But EI is also integral with creativity as well as being essential for collaboration. I mentioned our workshop earlier. One of the things we do in that workshop is develop a plan for developing emotional intelligence. So that leads us into creativity. And on the next slide, you see this wonderful guy, Albert Einstein. And if you look at the bottom of the slide, he said, no problem can be solved with the same, do you know, I've gone blank on this. No problem can be solved with the same level of consciousness that created it. Forgive me there. I just had a blank moment. That's a quote I almost know off by heart. But anyway, the point about it is that when we allow our creativity and allow divergent thinking, we find many alternative solutions. We use our imagination and we're unconventional. In Disney, they call it Imagineering. And creativity releases when we allow ourselves to think freely. We're actually born creative, but our daily work tends to remove it from us. And we can restore the creativity with theatre, writing, music, painting, all of those. And, you know, I'm talking about being a player, not being a spectator. So, again, I mentioned earlier, all of this is borne out by much research. So let's go to the next slide. And here's some research that was done by a lady called Nancy Andreasen. She's the chair of psychiatry at the University of Iowa. And it was from an article recently published in Atlantic magazine. First point she makes is that having a high IQ is not equivalent to being highly creative. However, creative people work hard. They work harder than the average person. They tend to be adventuresome. They explore. They take risks. And what we also find is that creative people have broad interests. I've already mentioned Michelangelo. Also, as well as being artists, they're mathematicians. And the same goes for right up to the present day, George Lucas. This divergent thinking produced many alternative responses to selected questions. But there's a thing that people overlook. Creative ideas often strike when our mind is relaxed. The famous story of Archimedes. Our physics teacher used to say that, well, he took a bath, the water overflowed, and he got the concept of specific gravity. The physics teacher totally missed the point. He took a bath, he relaxed, and that was when the eureka moment came. And eureka moments usually for a long period of time. Isaac Newton had been working on the theory of gravity for 20 years. Let's go a little deeper on this on the next slide. And so where people often go wrong, though, with creativity is they jump in to try and find solutions before defining the problem. People need to understand the issue before they start being creative. They need to agree a definition. And there are many tools for doing this. Customer experience mapping, a bit like process mapping, is a good way of doing it. We need to avoid jumping to conclusions, to solutions. And so when we get a problem, it's important to specify its consequences in concept terms. And we need very specific problem-solving skill sets for innovation. We need creativity followed by critical thinking. And I'm going to quote Einstein again on the matter of defining the problem. He said, if I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem. So let's go to the next slide. And you don't just jump in to be creative. You loosen up. And, you know, there's many exercises for doing this. The one I like is the one they use in the theatre, particularly when they're doing improv. They stand in a group and they build a story on a random basis. You know, first person says, beautiful day out there, and they clap their hands. The second person says, I think I'll go for a walk, clap their hands. Third person says, I think I'll take the dog. And the fourth person says, I think I'll take my swimming things. So you're starting to get this crazy picture building, you know, and that's how you loosen up people's minds and how they become increasingly creative. So let me take you a step further now on the next slide. And there are many forms, many methods of ideation or idea creation, as we call it. And typically the adult, if you give them, they'll think of 3 to 4 alternative solutions. So when I'm working with the group, I get people on their own to, you know, I give them a problem to work on. I usually start, if I'm doing it first time out, I say find 3 or 4 alternative uses for a man's sock. And they write it down on their own. Then I say turn to your neighbour, and they discuss it. And after about 5 minutes, I start to hear a hum, and there may be a laugh. So I know people are loosening up. Then I say, okay, turn back to your other neighbour, and then back to the first neighbour, and gradually they're building and building ideas. And then I say, okay, let's put it all out on the table. And we will get as many as 30 or 40 or more ideas. There are many techniques, brainwriting, clustering, but they all base on that kind of approach. So let me take you a little further on this. And this thing called the epiphany. That is when we get the breakthrough. It often comes unexpectedly. It's, like I said a moment ago, when people relax. And I quoted Archimedes. What I suggest to you is that when you're doing ideation, you use multiple sessions and get lots of ideas. But importantly, you have a method of capturing ideas between sessions, some kind of electronic repository. But now I've created lots of ideas. I'm going to quote Linus Pauling again. He said, the best way to get a good idea is to get lots of ideas, but then throw away the bad ones. And that takes us into the next slide, which is about critical thinking. The earliest record is from Socrates, and he brought out the importance of probing how valid thinking is, finding good supporting evidence. Where did the idea come from? How real it is? And this is what we do when we're doing complex problem solving, when we are innovating. We get lots of ideas, as Linus Pauling said, and then we need to sort them based on criteria such as time, cost, and risk. And we use critical thinking to analyze the alternative. Let me take you into critical thinking a little deeper on the next slide. So a critical thinker, will question all of the solutions. They will gather and evaluate information. And what they will find is that there are uncertainties attached to all of the ideas. But they'll also find that there are potentials attached to all of the ideas. And they will test solutions against the criteria, and they will converge to a consensus and arrive at well-reasoned conclusions. So, to the next slide. This is the end game in critical thinking, the end game of complex problem solving. We gather information from the creativity, we test the assumptions for time, cost, and risk, we restructure our thoughts, we reflect, we come to conclusions, and we test our solutions to see they work, but importantly, we translate the solutions into action. So on to the next slide. We then need that leadership attribute that I talked about right at the beginning. Leaders deliver. Leadership's not just a title. It's an attribute. And it's also an activity. Leaders in the world of innovation challenge the status quo. Good leaders are driven by curiosity and courage, and they inspire people. You know, Henry Ford was a good example. He was looking for the aftermath of action. He was curious. And you probably know the story. He was touring a meat factory, and he saw meat being transported, hanging on hooks. And he thought, there's my answer. He was able to take a concept from a different environment. And as a result of that, his Model T by 1908 had captured the US market. But you know, it's difficult for leaders to stay curious. And by the 1980s, people wanted variety. And Henry Ford said, oh, you can have any color as long as it's black. And of course, General Motors captured his market. So let's look a bit more at leadership on the next slide. Leaders set the culture. They need to understand the organization and its behaviors. They need to recognize the behaviors that they're looking for to enable innovation and complex problem solving. Engaging people is the leader's most important, actually, because a leader can't do it all on their own. You know, leaders may not be particularly creative, but they should make sure that the strategy flows. And in that creative phase, they may observe, they will learn, they must understand, even if they don't feel particularly creative. But they will involve directly in the execution of a solution. So let me take you into one more slide and summarize the steps that I've taken you through. We need to understand complexity at the outset and create a collaborative environment in which we have a group of diverse problem solvers. We assist that diversity by addressing emotional intelligence so people can work together. And then we do that famous divergence through creativity to find alternative solutions, and converge through critical thinking to find the best path forward. And leaders deliver and make sure that innovation happens. And all of those elements that I've shown you on this slide, what I pointed out to you right at the outset in the World Economic Forum report. And let me show you the last slide now. And path forward. These are the things you can do. I suggest you do an emotional intelligence assessment. Find out where you need to improve. We all have different aspects of EI that we can work on. Develop your creativity. Try theatre. They're always looking for help. I like to write and I like to paint. I wish I could play music. I did years ago. And, you know, if you go to our website, you can find out where you fit best in the innovation cycle. Just go to petermerrill.com. And if you're really interested, we've got our workshop on innovative skills that I can point you to. And you'll notice on this slide, I've taken the liberty of showing my book, which is due to come out any day now, in a couple of weeks, in fact. ISO standard on innovation management. What I've been taking you through is how to manage innovation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There you have it, the complex skills needed in today's diverse complexity. Thank you, Mr. Peter Merrill, for that very insightful talk. We are now opening the floor for a short Q&A. Please submit your questions to Slido using the code 45616.
Nora? Once again, we have a question for our speaker, Mr. Peter Merrill. What do you think is the most effective leadership strategy to engage mixed generations of the workforce, from baby boomers to Generation X, Y, and Z, to actively engage and collaborate in promoting innovation for the future?
Yeah. I didn't mention the cross-age workforce, and as you rightly point out, we have so many different age groups with so many different, I'll call it propensities, needing to work together. And I go back to Stephen Covey and his famous saying, seek to understand before you seek to be understood. And I think it's very important that each age group understands what the other age groups can bring. And if you look at millennials, for instance, they are very good at collaborating. They share very freely their knowledge, but within their own age group and not so much outside of it. If you go to the other extreme, the boomers, then, you know, they have enormous experience to share, but they mustn't be overreaching. They mustn't be dominant on that and arrogant, which is a weakness, a tendency. And then in between that, Generation X and Generation Y, it's interesting. I've noticed some of the tensions that exist, believe it or not, between Gen X and the millennials. I know somebody who is a Gen X human resource, and she said, you know, millennials, they won't take responsibility, you know. So it's important to understand what each age group has as an asset, and for the other great age groups to understand that. We used to get a lot, going back 5 years ago, there was a lot of work being done about, you know, how the different age groups should understand each other. And it's all out there. But I go back to that first thing I said. Seek to understand before you seek to be understood.
Another question. Do you believe that everyone has creativity and critical thinking, but only comes to life with a certain amount of funding? If so, does this mean that a random idea with proper funding will more likely come to life rather than a long-term great idea that nobody would want to invest in?
First thing I would say is that not everybody has to be creative. I mentioned quickly that on our website we have an assessment in which people can find where they fit best in the innovation cycle, whether they're most comfortable in the creative stage or whether they're most comfortable in the analytical and delivery stage. And I think it's important for people to find that and not try to be something they're not. In other words, do what you do well. Play to your strengths. If you are an analytical person, a lot of them think, oh, well, I haven't got a role in innovation. Yes, you have. Thomas Edison said genius is 1% inspiration, 99% perspiration. It's actually the analytical people who have the hard work to do. They've got the tough job. So we don't all have to be creative. Now, there was another part in the question there which I think I missed. What have I missed in that question?
There was the question was for creativity and critical thinking. So does this mean that a random idea with proper funding will more likely come to life rather than a long-term great idea that nobody would want to invest in?
Okay. That points to another issue. Thank you. Yes, the other issue is that if you look at the data, if you look at the analysis, the biggest single reason for failure is people developing something that nobody wants. A lot of people do not analyze the opportunity. They go straight into finding potential solutions. You know, they have a great idea. They say, oh, it's the best idea since sliced bread, but they have no idea whether people really want that solution they've come up with. So opportunity first, define the problem, and then find the alternative solutions. And I find one of the biggest weaknesses is people do not separate opportunity from solution. They try to do the two together, and that gets them in trouble.
I see. Now we have one final question for Mr. Merrill. How can we promote creativity and divergent thinking in the workplace?
Yes, I'm actually working with a company at the moment, which is, and they are very keen to engage their workforce. You know, some research done by IBM a few years ago showed that the three best sources of ideas are customers, suppliers, but by far the best, our own people. So engaging our own people needs to be done in a very careful way. You don't just run out there and say, give us your best ideas. That is the path to failure. And I can speak from very personal experience. As you know, I used to be chief executive of business in the UK. And when the corporation gave me the business unit to run, one of the first things I did, thinking I was engaging people, was I went out and I said, okay, tell me what you want, tell me what you need. Well, I noticed that there was no way I was going to be able to fulfill. What I learned from that was you need to find out what the problems are, not what people think they want. And, you know, there are certain key questions that when I'm engaging a workforce, I start off by saying, what are your biggest hassles? Where do you waste time? Where do you not have clear requirements? And those questions flush out what are the issues. But we don't just do it randomly. We do it in a framework, and we say, when we get all the answers, we're going to analyze them and see where our best opportunities are. And when we've got those best opportunities, we'll come back and we'll say, okay, what do you think we can do to solve these? And we'll keep the whole thing transparent. We will use a cost-benefit analysis. A lot of them will be process improvements to start with, and that's where you begin. And people gradually grow into innovation after they've been used to process improvement. So it's a big job, and engaging the people is something we do gradually over the time. We don't just jump in straight away.
All right, that concludes our Q&A. Thank you once again, Mr. Peter Merrill.